Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're diving into this whole idea of bad company and how to avoid falling into its trap.
Yeah, it's fascinating, isn't it?
It really is. And, we've got this podcast episode that we're looking at today titled, How Can We Overcome the Influence of Bad Company and Thrive Spiritually?
Mm.
And it's packed with insights into how our very human need to connect can actually make us vulnerable.
Right, and I think that's something we can all relate to.
Oh, absolutely.
That desire to belong, to be part of something bigger than ourselves.
Well, but
It's wired into our DNA.
Yeah. And, even way back in Genesis 2.18, it says, it is not good for man to be alone.
Exactly. So this need for connection, it's fundamental to who we are.
Okay, so we're social creatures by design.
Mm.
But how does that make us susceptible to influence, especially the negative kind?
Well, you see, it's all about this inherent desire to fit in, to be accepted by the group.
Mm-hmm.
And this need for acceptance, it can make us unconsciously sensitive to the opinions and behaviors of those around us.
So we start mirroring those around us.
Exactly. We kind of adapt to fit in. And in that process, we pick up both the good and the bad.
So it's like our social circles have this invisible molding effect on us, shaping us in ways we might not even realize.
Precisely. And this episode introduces a term called mentionitis.
Mentionitis.
Yeah, it describes how the simple act of repeated exposure to something can actually influence our thoughts and actions.
Oh, that's interesting. I've never heard of that term before.
Yeah, it's fascinating. Have you ever experienced this mentionitis effect yourself?
I'm sure I have.
Yeah.
I mean, think about those kitschy advertising jingles.
Exactly. You hear them enough times and suddenly you find yourself humming along without even realizing it.
Oh, totally. Or how about that one friend who always uses a particular slang word?
Yes. The one.
And then you catch yourself using it, too. It's like, it's contagious.
It really is. And that's the power of mentionitis.
So it's like our brains are constantly absorbing information, and that repetition starts to wear a groove in our thinking. Almost like creating a pathway for those thoughts and behaviors to become habits.
Exactly. It's incredible how easily this happens. The podcast uses this analogy. Ideas are like nails. You have to hit them several times to drive them in.
That's a good one.
Right. What we repeatedly see and hear, it starts to take root in our minds.
Okay, so we've talked about how habits form, but now I'm curious about how our senses play a role in this whole influence game.
Right.
The episode talks about our senses being like open doors to our inner world. What do they mean by that?
Oh, think about it. Our senses, sight, sound, touch, taste, smell, they're constantly taking in information.
Right.
Everything we experience floods our senses, and it's shaping our perceptions, influencing our thoughts and actions.
So it's not just about consciously choosing to imitate someone, but about this constant stream of sensory input that's shaping our inner world without us even realizing it.
Exactly. It's a subtle but powerful process.
Wow, so this has implications for everything.
It really does.
The media we consume, the social circles we choose, even the physical spaces we inhabit.
Precisely. Everything we're exposed to is contributing to that invisible molding process.
That's a bit unsettling when you think about it.
It is, isn't it? It really highlights the need to be intentional about what we're letting into our inner world.
Totally, both through the people we spend time with and the environments we choose to be in.
Absolutely.
Okay, well, let's shift gears a bit and talk about peer pressure. The episode actually highlights this really powerful story from the Bible about Peter denying Jesus.
Oh, yes.
Even though Peter was one of Jesus's closest disciples, he still crumbled under the pressure of the crowd. It's a pretty stark example of how even the strongest among us can be swayed by social pressure.
It is, isn't it?
Yeah, it makes you wonder, what is it about peer pressure that makes it so potent? Is it just a fear of being ostracized, or is there something deeper going on?
Well, the episode delves into the concept of emotional bonds and how they play a crucial role in amplifying peer pressure.
Emotional bonds.
Yes. Think about those undercover police officers who infiltrate criminal organizations.
Oh, okay.
They build relationships, they share experiences, and over time, a sense of obligation and compromise can emerge.
So even if their values fundamentally clash with the criminal group, those shared experiences and emotional ties make it difficult to resist the pressure to conform.
Exactly. It's like they're caught in this web of conflicting loyalties.
That's a bit unsettling, isn't it? It really highlights the importance of being mindful of who we allow into our inner circle and how those relationships might be shaping our decisions even without us realizing it.
Precisely. And that leads us to this question of how we navigate relationships with people who hold different values.
Right, because you can't exactly isolate yourself from everyone who sees the world differently.
No, you can't live in a bubble.
It's simply not realistic.
Yeah.
The podcast actually addresses this using a passage from the Apostle Paul in 1 Corinthians 5:9 to 10.
Oh, interesting.
And it seems like the key takeaway is that it's not about total avoidance, but about navigating those interactions wisely.
Right. Finding that balance between protecting yourself and staying open to growth.
Because, after all, encountering diverse viewpoints can be an opportunity to challenge your own assumptions and expand your understanding of the world.
Exactly. It's about approaching those relationships with wisdom and discernment, recognizing that they can be sources of both challenge and growth.
So it's more nuanced than just cutting people out of our lives because they hold different views.
Yes, it's about recognizing the complexity of human relationships and approaching them with both caution and compassion.
Okay, I like that. And the podcast reminds us of the wisdom in Proverbs 4:23, which says, "Above all else, guard your heart, for everything you do flows from it."
Such a powerful verse.
It really is. So we're talking about guarding our hearts, being discerning in our relationships, and recognizing that subtle power of influence. But how do we actually do that in a practical sense?
Yeah, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
It is. What are some tangible steps we can take to cultivate that inner resilience and protect ourselves from negative influences?
Well, that's something we'll dive into more deeply in the next part of our deep dive.
Okay, good tease.
But for now, I think the most important takeaway is this. Influence is a powerful force, but it doesn't have to control us.
I love that.
We have the power to choose our influences, to cultivate positive habits, and to create an inner world that supports our growth and well-being.
This has been an incredible start to our deep dive. We've uncovered how our inherent need for connection makes us susceptible to influence, how menschenitis can shape our thinking, and how our senses play a critical role in this whole process.
It's amazing, isn't it?
It really is, and we've only just scratched the surface. Stay tuned for part 2, where we'll dive into some practical tips for building resilience and harnessing the power of influence for good.
I can't wait.
Me neither. All right, so we're back and ready to get practical. In part 1, we really dug into how susceptible we are to all these influences around us.
Yeah, we talked about how our brains are wired for connection, how those repeated exposures shape our thinking, and how our senses are constantly taking in information, shaping our inner world without us even realizing it.
All right, so now let's flip the script and talk about what we can do to protect ourselves. What are some practical steps we can take to build resilience against those negative influences?
Well, the podcast offers some really solid advice on this, and the first thing they emphasize is being mindful of your social diet.
Your social diet.
Yeah, it's like, just like you wouldn't eat junk food every day and expect to be healthy, you shouldn't surround yourself with negativity and expect to thrive.
That's a great analogy. So who we spend time with really does matter.
Yeah.
It's about choosing our company wisely.
Exactly. And they also talk about developing a strong inner compass.
Okay, an inner compass. What's that all about?
Well, it's essentially your set of core values and beliefs. It's what guides your decisions and actions, what helps you stay true to yourself, even when you're facing pressure or temptation.
So it's like having that internal GPS, keeping you on track, even when you're navigating some pretty rough terrain.
Precisely. And the way you develop this inner compass is through self-reflection. Take some time to really get to know yourself, your values, your beliefs, what's truly important to you. The podcast also suggests finding sources of inspiration and wisdom that align with those values.
Okay, so that could be anything from books to mentors to religious texts. Right?
Exactly. It's about actively seeking out those things that nourish your mind and spirit, that help you grow and evolve.
So it sounds like it takes effort.
Yeah.
We can't just passively wait for our inner compass to magically appear. We have to actively seek it out and cultivate it.
You got it. It's about making conscious choices about what we allow into our mental and emotional space. And that brings us to another crucial tip, being aware of your
Triggers.
Yeah. We all have certain things that make us more susceptible to negative influence. It might be stress fatigue, loneliness, or even specific people or environments that just bring out the worst in us.
Oh yeah, I can definitely relate to that. When I'm feeling super stressed, my fuse is definitely shorter.
Exactly. So the key is to first identify those personal triggers and then develop strategies for managing them.
So what kind of strategies are we talking about?
Well, it could be anything from practicing mindfulness, setting boundaries with difficult people, or even simply avoiding certain situations when you know you're feeling vulnerable.
So it's about recognizing those early warning signs.
Yeah.
Those red flags that tell us we're headed for trouble.
Precisely. And then making a conscious choice to step back and choose a different path.
It's about being proactive, not reactive.
Exactly. And the final tip they offer is about cultivating a positive mindset.
Okay, so what does that look like in practice?
Well, it doesn't mean ignoring the negative or pretending everything is perfect.
Right.
It's about making a conscious effort to focus on the good. It's about practicing gratitude, seeking out things that uplift and inspire you, and surrounding yourself with people who do the same.
So if we're actively filling our minds with positivity, there's less room for negativity to take hold.
Exactly. It's like crowding out the weeds with beautiful flowers.
I like that analogy. But, it's important to acknowledge that life isn't always sunshine and rainbows. We all face challenges and difficulty.
Absolutely. And the podcast makes it clear that this isn't about being naive or living in a Pollyanna bubble. It's
Ah.
about choosing to focus on the good, even in the midst of those challenges, and to believe that positive change is possible.
So it's about choosing hope, even when things feel tough.
Exactly. It's about cultivating that inner strength and resilience that allows you to weather the storms.
Okay, so we've talked a lot about avoiding negative influence, but what about those situations where even challenging relationships can be opportunities for growth?
Yeah, that's a great point. And the podcast doesn't give any hard and fast rules, but they do suggest asking yourself some key questions about the relationship.
Like what?
Well, they suggest asking, does this person bring out the best in me? Do I feel genuinely respected and valued in this relationship? Does this relationship align with my overall goals and aspirations?
Hmm, those are good questions. They really make you stop and evaluate whether the relationship is serving you or holding you back.
Right. And sometimes those relationships that push us out of our comfort zones can be the most valuable.
You know what I'm noticing a theme here?
What's that?
It's all about intentionality.
Yes.
Whether we're talking about choosing our social circles, cultivating a positive mindset, or navigating difficult relationships, it's about being aware and making choices that support our growth and well-being.
You nailed it. We're not just passive recipients of influence.
Yeah.
We have the power to choose our influences, to cultivate a healthy inner world, and to create a life that reflects our values.
I love that. So how does all of this apply to something like media consumption? We're not just influenced by people, but also by that constant stream of information coming at us from all directions.
That's such an important point. And the podcast cleverly connects us back to the open doors analogy we talked about earlier.
Right. Our senses are constantly taking in information.
Exactly. And just like our senses are bombarded, our media consumption plays a huge role in shaping our thoughts and perceptions.
So it's not just about being mindful of our social circles. It's about being equally discerning about what we're reading, watching, listening to.
Absolutely. And the same principles apply. We need to be mindful of our media diet just like we are with our food choices.
So how do we navigate that? There's so much information out there. It's overwhelming. Where do we even begin?
Well, the podcast suggests starting with those same insightful questions we talked about earlier.
Okay.
Ask yourself, what kind of content am I consuming? Does it align with my values? Does it inspire me, uplift me, challenge me in a healthy way? Or does it leave me feeling drained, anxious, or negative?
That's a great framework. So it's about taking ownership of our media consumption and making choices that nourish our minds and spirits.
Exactly. But it's also important to remember that we're not always in control of the content that comes our way.
Right. Algorithms curate our social media feeds. News outlets have their own agendas. And it can feel impossible to escape all the negativity and sensationalism.
It's true. And that's why it's even more crucial to be discerning, to question what we see and hear, and to be aware of those potential biases or agendas that might be at play.
So we can't just passively absorb everything that comes at us. We have to be active participants in shaping our own understanding of the world.
Beautifully said. It's about being intentional, discerning, and proactive in how we engage with the media landscape.
This has been an incredibly insightful conversation.
Yeah.
We've really unpacked the power of influence from so many angles, and I feel like I have a whole new toolbox for navigating it more intentionally.
Me too. It's been a pleasure exploring this with you.
And we're back for the final part of our deep dive. It's amazing how much ground we've covered on this whole idea of influence.
It is, isn't it?
Yeah, we've really explored how much our surroundings shape who we are.
Right from our friends and family to the stuff we see on our screens.
Exactly. And as we wrap up this exploration, what are some of the key takeaways we want our listeners to walk away with?
Well, I think the most important message is this. You have more control over your life than you might think.
I like that.
You're not just a puppet being pulled by strings. You're not simply a product of your environment. You have the power to choose to make decisions that shape your own path.
So it's about being proactive, not passive.
Exactly. And that starts with awareness. The more you understand how influence works, the better equipped you are to navigate it.
Right, so pay attention to the people you hang out with, the media you consume, the places you spend your time.
All those things are influencing you, whether you realize it or not.
Just like that saying, choose your friends wisely, but on a much bigger scale.
Yeah, it's about being intentional about all the influences you allow into your life.
And I imagine those choices aren't always easy. There are times when we face pressure to conform, to go along with the crowd, even when it doesn't feel right.
Absolutely. And that's where having that strong inner compass comes in.
Right. The more we know ourselves and our values, the easier it is
Right.
to navigate those tricky situations.
Precisely. It's about having the courage to stand firm in your convictions, even when it's tough.
It's about being true to yourself.
Exactly. And building that inner compass, it takes work. It's a lifelong journey, but it's so worth it because it gives you that sense of grounding, that sense of direction, even when everything around you feels chaotic.
So it's about having that internal anchor that keeps us steady, even when the seas get rough.
That's a great way to put it. And remember, building resilience doesn't mean being rigid or closed off to new ideas.
Okay.
It's about having a strong sense of self so that you can engage with the world authentically.
So it's about being open to new experiences, but also knowing your boundaries.
Precisely. And this applies to everything from our relationships to our media choices. It's about focusing on the things that uplift you, that inspire you, that challenge you in a healthy way.
I love that. This whole conversation has been so eye-opening for me.
It has for me, too.
I feel like I have a whole new understanding of how to navigate this crazy world of influence.
Me too. And at the end of the day, it's all about making choices that support your growth and well-being.
Exactly. It's about creating a life that reflects your values and aspirations.
Beautifully said.
And a huge thank you to our listeners for joining us on this deep dive into the power of influence. We hope you found it insightful and empowering.
We did.
Remember, you have more control than you think. You can choose your influences, cultivate positive habits, and build a life that truly lights you up. We'll see you next time on The Deep Dive.